Welcome, everybody. We're about to start another event in my series of China-oriented discussion events. And today I'm extremely happy to be joined by three great experts with whom I will introduce to you in a second, discussing the issue of decoupling. Decoupling has been a catchphrase for many years now. Are we decoupling from China? Should we decouple from China? But now we try to look at the inverse perspective. Is China possibly decoupling from us, or maybe in some sectors? So decoupling with Chinese characteristics, question mark, is our topic. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer, and I'm a member of the European Parliament and your moderator today. So let me introduce the three excellent panelists. First, Alicia Garcia Herrero will speak. She is a senior fellow at the European think tank Bruegel. She's also the chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis and non-resident research fellow at the Madrid-based political think tanks Real Instituto Elcano. She's currently also adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and member of the advisory board of Berlin-based China think tank MERIX, and has many other functions. And I will stop reading all of that to you because it's better to hear from her than me reading her CV. Then second in the sequence will be Dr. Franz Paul van der Putten, who is a senior research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute. His area of research is the geopolitical significance of the rise of China as a global power. He's the coordinator of the Klingendahl China Center. He studied at Leiden University, and he has also worked at Nienrode Business University. And third in line will be Jacob Gunter, who is a senior analyst economy at MERIX, the Berlin-based China think tank. He brings 10 years of experience in China to the role, including the most recent 4 years as the lead pen of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, where he served as a senior policy and communications manager. He covers China's political economy, industrial policy, innovation, self-reliance, decoupling, and examines how the EU can better economically compete with China in third markets. So this is our setup. And now what are we going to discuss? I will read a couple of questions that I posed to our experts. And of course, they will address it from whichever angle they think makes most sense. And each of them will have about 10 minutes to give their introductory remarks. So the questions could be, is it fair to say that there are or have been targeted decoupling or self-dependency strategies in China's economic policy? In which sectors would such a policy be most visible? How have protectionist policies evolved in China over the recent years, particularly since China's WTO accession? If China is indeed decoupling in some sectors, what is the underlying rationale? How do domestic goals, geopolitical aspirations, and/or the need to react to policies of other countries determine China's economic strategy? For which industrial sectors and which kind of economic actors, like SMEs, are concerns about China's possible decoupling most valid? And looking ahead, would you expect China to pursue a principled policy of long-term economic partnership with the EU, or would you see a different trajectory, either one that leads to more decoupling or one that shapes the partnership according to political expediency? These kind of questions and many more aspects that are important from the vantage point of our experts will be discussed. And after the introductory remarks, everybody on the call is invited to join the conversation. So let me start with you, Alicia. Please take the floor. And welcome, of course.
Thank you, Reinhard. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Actually, it's such a pleasure to share views on this very important topic. I'm going to use a few slides because at the end of the day, I'm an economist. I like numbers, and I do think that numbers can give us a sense of the dimension of that selective decoupling we're discussing. But I'm going to start from the very beginning, which is the US-China strategic competition. And the story goes as to, is it the US decoupling? Is it China decoupling? So what I have here is really about both pushing in this direction and where, and then what the EU might do about it. And I hope I will be answering some of the questions that were Reinhard had for us, in particular, the rationale for decoupling for China. So here you go. So US-China, US containment first, and then China's response. Although in some cases, it's not even a response. It's an action that may have started even before the response. And I think that's something that needs further discussion. So on the first, the idea starts with trade, as we know, and this is Trump's so-called trade war. But if we were to focus on trade, we wouldn't see much decoupling, at least as much as the gross figures are concerned, especially after COVID. So this graph is used many times in China for evidence that containment doesn't work, that nothing is happening. So I'm going to go beyond this graph and start looking at trade, but tech-related trade. And a way to measure this is to look at export controls. So what you can see from these numbers is that the approved licenses for tangible items, so software and others, are coming down globally. So in a way, you could argue that the US is contained in the whole world as far as technology is concerned, or worried about the whole world, but it is so much more the case for China. The other way to look at containment from the US is, of course, sanctions, and especially in the tech space. So yes, maybe it's not full-fledged decoupling trade-wise, but it is selective decoupling as far as tech is concerned on the trade space. So these are the sanctions related to, for example, the BIS entity list, so export controls, as I mentioned, but also the entity list. But the thing doesn't stop there. It's not only about trade, it's also about finance. And we're seeing much more of that selective decoupling in finance going forward. So the one example, obviously, and it's very timely because we had many more companies, I think around 20 companies, additional companies included in the US OFAC, basically Office of Foreign Assets Controls list of Chinese military-related companies. And you go all the way to Didi. So, it's like you can see Xiaomi, companies that you may argue might not necessarily be military-related. I have no idea whether they are or not, but the point is this list is growing. And therefore, it's another important tool of selective decoupling in as far as US investors cannot cannot trade with these names. Beyond that, we can't forget that even if trade is growing, there is parts of that trade that are subject to increasing scrutiny from the US, and this time around even from Europe. And this is about, of course, the supply chain, the resilience of the supply chain, and the US executive order on that in that regard, but also, of course, the idea of due diligence of supply chains in the European case. So again, it's not about the whole trade, but it's about specific aspects of trade, whether it's tech related or it is supply chain related, so critical imports, etc. And beyond that, for FDI, we've seen a downward trend for years that has reversed, although the data doesn't show it because I didn't manage to update this graph. But in 2020, US FDI into China has increased. For that matter, the whole world's FDI into China has increased after COVID. So in a way, it's interesting that COVID has brought more exports to China, but also more inward FDI. But the reality is that this is very much driven by a number of sectors that have been opened recently, such as US financial institutions flocking into China. But the question is, will it continue? And we can have a discussion here, but my sense is that in this space as well, we will see more selective decoupling. And the reason being that there's a number of sectors that are affected by basically tech-related selective decoupling, by which it will be increasingly hard for US companies to operate in China on that front. On portfolio flows, it's kind of asymmetric. China is kind of, I wouldn't say leaving the dollar, but reducing its holdings of US dollars, while the US is increasing its holdings of Chinese long-term securities and generally securities, whether equity or fixed asset investment. This is a trend that can be explained basically by the fact that China is now part of global indices, whether bond or equities, more than really a search for profitability. If you think about the stock market in China this year, for example, you just can't understand why these flows continue to reach China. But the reality is that this is an index-related issue, a diversification-related issue. For how long will it last is hard to tell. But again, because of the sanctions, because of the increasing push by the US, it might well be that it's harder and harder to continue. On FDI, we all know about the reform of CFIUS, how hard it is now for Chinese investors to buy into the US. This is not so much true for Europe, notwithstanding our efforts on investment screening. So if I don't have the data in this presentation, but I could show you that around 60 to 70% of China's M&A in the last 3 to 4 years have actually been reaching our shores, i.e. the European Union. So that's where most of the money is going, and the sectors are basically high tech sectors, whether it's robotics, semiconductors, industrial technology more generally. What is China doing now, very quickly? So is China just just staying and saying, oh, I've been targeted and please help, or something like that? No, not really. Actually, you can count measures and countermeasures from China one by one. BIS entity list, so this is the export controls, though. Foreign direct product rule, the unreliable entity list. Reforms of CFIUS, etc. So basically, China is reacting at the very same way. Perhaps one very important example is the China anti-sanction legislation. I'll come back to this in the conclusions, because part of this retaliation, and this is the key point, China's retaliation towards the US affects Europe directly. So that's kind of the difficulty in separating selective decoupling between US and China and ourselves, because a lot of these actions will come back to us. And a very important one, which has not yet been legislated, is the Hong Kong anti-sanction legislation. Why? Because this is basically affecting the whole of the Hong Kong offshore market. And that's very different from a similar action in China with the non-convertible currency. So it's just a different ballgame. And I think that's why it's taking long to be approved. So beyond that, and this is really Reinhardt's question, what is China doing about, is China putting more pressure to become self-reliant and maybe even creating additional dependence on the rest of the world? So I think in that regard, dual circulation is the key concept here. The one thing that we need to realize is that China does have bottlenecks. It's just that it's not only about increasing the world's dependence on China, which China is doing in some instances. In my opinion, the most obvious case is solar panels with 80% of global production, but increasingly components of batteries, electric vehicle batteries, with about 65% of global share. But on the other hand, China also needs to reduce its own dependence from the rest of the world. And I think the best example is semiconductors. And you can see that China's demand is humongous, but its supply is very limited. And most of that supply is basically on, if you look at that very technical graph, on the end phase, meaning on the assembly, certainly not on the on the highest end, which is of course design. So, well, I did have the graph, sorry. This is about China reacting to all of this by buying companies abroad, and Europe being a very important target. Finally, China's reaction to one of the key areas of containment for the US, which I did say was finance increasingly, and this is the delisting of companies in the US, is really about finding other places for Chinese companies to list. Hong Kong is the most obvious case, as we saw with Didi recently, but also China itself. So it's about bringing companies back to China, Star and Beijing New Stock Exchange. Why is China doing this? Because China truly believes that the rest of the world will follow, that if it is not listed in the US, those investors will come all the way to Hong Kong, let alone China eventually, to invest. And that is important. And I just want to add that, because if you want to internationalize the currency, you want inflows into that currency in your country. And as the US has had for decades and if not centuries. So China does prefer, some people don't understand why they actually are fine with the delisting, and they're fine with the delisting because they think that, you know, those investors are going to follow. So think about the question by Reinhardt, dependence. We think they depend on the US stock market, but they're thinking maybe we can actually turn that dependence into a different type of dependence, i.e. investors depending on our market as we grow bigger in that sense. And for that, there's nothing as long-term thinking in a way as the digital currency, because that's what it is, the digital currency. So what I mentioned about IPOs, etc., and flows into China, that's for investment purposes. And that's how you create an international currency. But you also need payments in that currency. And the digital currency is a way for China to increase payments in renminbi across the border. And I'm not saying it may not have other objectives, but I'm focusing here on what matters to our query, which is decoupling, etc. So by signing MOUs, memorandum of understanding with other central banks in the region, Thailand, Hong Kong, but even the UAE, China is making it possible to use its legal tender as a legal tender elsewhere through this digital currency. And that will increase certainly payments overseas. They are starting with these economies because there's a lot of Chinese presence and tourists, which will make it clearly more feasible, notwithstanding a still closed capital account or rather closed capital account. So in 1 minute, I need to say, why did I go through all of this and I didn't hardly mention Europe? Because the point I'm going to make here is that a lot of what we experience when we talk about dependence or selective decoupling comes from this strategic competition from the US, which is forcing Europe to take a stance. So why? Because we are harmed by both actions. On the one hand, we're harmed by the US push towards China, because in a way that belligerence can be mimicked in our market, and sometimes we can be a collateral damage of these actions. But beyond that, China's retaliation towards the US actually hits us as well for many, many reasons. But a very important one is basically the extraterritoriality of the dollar. And that's an immediate channel for us to be targeted, let alone the fact that China sometimes may prefer to target a second option, which is easier than the US itself. And the case of Australia is, to me, very telling, and clearly something for Europeans to learn from. So, so basically, our answer has been strategic autonomy, in a way to be in the middle of this pendulum. And we have taken, of course, this together with measures, or at least very recently, like the anti-coercion mechanism. But I just think that is only, it's very, very targeted, and also is very, I like to see whether we're going to actually use it, because if not, this deterrence is basically lacks enforcement, or at least the ability to enforce. And it does not cover a very important point, which was really the question by Reinhardt, which is excessive dependence. So for that, I think we need a plan of basically reshuffling, or at least intelligent reshuffling of our value chains. And we need an instrument to think that through, which I don't think we have so far, because I mean, what we've thought through is really all about very specific cases for which we may need to review our value chains. And they're not based on excessive dependence, which is a very different concept than what we have so far, which is basically about human rights and you name it. So we need more creative thinking, and I just leave the floor to the next speaker. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And now we move on to Mr. van der Putten. Please take the floor, sir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity for me to speak in this webinar. And since I'm not an economist, I'm not going to present numbers, and I don't have slides that I want to share with you. I just have a brief set of observations and remarks that I want to mention. First of all, I think the issue of whether China is also actively, engaged in a policy of decoupling is to some extent a matter of whether or not you want to use that term. I think it's more important to recognize that whatever China is doing is partly driven by different motivations than, for instance, what the United States is doing, and also that this is not a direct response to what the United States is doing, but it is part of a much longer standing approach, I think, that China has. If you go back to 1978 and the launch of the reform era in China, I think ever since then the Chinese government has realized that it needs to open up economically to the world in order to become stronger, which means that China would become increasingly dependent on the outside world, economically dependent on the outside world, in order to become stronger. So, of course, in order to become geopolitically also stronger. So this tension between security and geopolitical security on the one hand, and economic dependence on the other hand, I think this is a long existing common feature of China's foreign policy and the way that the Chinese government looks at its foreign relations. So I think a major turning point was the global financial crisis from 2008 onwards. And I think the major driver at the time for the Chinese government was primarily economic, not geopolitical, but economic. So the thought that China had reached a point where it was no longer a feasible long-term policy to further increase China's dependence on foreign export markets, for instance, and that China needed to shift to domestic consumption and decrease its dependence on exports as a major driver for its economic growth, and that this also involved a rapid buildup of Chinese competitiveness, especially through technological innovation. So I think the features that we see now, that are enforced by geopolitical issues and further enforced by the COVID situation, have been in place before. But even that decision after 2008, I think, was primarily caused by economic factors, but still also the geopolitical thinking was also a part of that. And I think the long-term repercussions that we have to take into account from Europe are several things. One is that both the dynamics inside China and the dynamics in the United States, and increasingly also transatlantic, so also on the European side, is that there seems to be a move towards a greater distance economically between China on the one hand and US and Europe on the other hand. This can happen in various ways, but I think the big trend is that we're moving in that direction. In terms of dependence, this means that bilaterally the economic dependence of Europe on China and of China on Europe will also decrease. But strategically speaking, it very much depends on whether China will be able to be very competitive in third markets. So because if those bilateral economic relationship decreases, it becomes more important for both sides, both for the European Union and for China, to expand their economic presence in third markets. And if China, one scenario could be that China actually would be more competitive in those third markets than European companies. This would mean then that this is a competitive disadvantage, a strategic disadvantage also for Europe. And then the second part of that story, I think, is that the leverage that the European Union currently has also as a geopolitical actor in its relationship with China is primarily based on the economic strength that Europe has and the things that Europe has that China needs. And I think those are in particular access to the European market and access to European technology. And if at some point at the future, China is no longer dependent on the European market, or much less so than today, and also much less dependent on European technology than it is today, then I think this would imply that also the geopolitical leverage that the European Union has in its relationship with China will be smaller than it currently is. So my final point is that it could be interesting for us to take another look at Chinese direct investment, because I think over the past few years, of course, Chinese direct investment in the European Union has already decreased. And we have, I think, it has been a very positive development that there are now more tools and greater awareness on how to deal with Chinese incoming direct investment in the European Union. But I think another part of the story is that as long as there are Chinese companies who are active in Europe, who have interest in by being present in Europe, this still is a source of, again, of some kind of leverage that Europe also can sometimes use to its advantage. So I guess I'm trying to say that by decreasing Chinese investment in Europe, you can get rid of some problems, but there's also some risk if there is too little Chinese direct investment in Europe. Thank you. These are my opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And third but not least, Mr. Gunter.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my slides. Okay, so I'll be looking a bit more into the nitty-gritty details of the drivers of decoupling, but also examining in which areas they're really impacting European companies, both positively and negatively, because it's a bit more diverse of a story than what many might anticipate. So agreeing very much with a lot of the discussion that's already come out from Alicia and Franz Paul, but I would just kind of add to that some of the drivers that we see kind of on the ground for European companies in China. So first, on the Chinese side, we see this kind of growing securitization of everything, and this view that any sort of external and cross-border risks need to be managed. And a lot of that has, a great deal of, historical trend behind it. China never fully allowed for integration of the rest of the world into China the way the rest of the world allowed China to integrate into it. But we're seeing that more and more of this has happened, especially since the trade and technology wars, especially that Alicia mentioned, that between the tariffs, but especially the export controls and the sanctions, this really pushed China to look at how it can secure its supply chains, both via onshoring and also by moving them to perhaps more politically friendly markets, but also how to onshore technology chains so that it couldn't be as easily hamstrung, especially after Huawei and ZTE initially were sort of, had a gun held to their hands or to their head by the Trump administration, and then later those sanctions did in fact materialize for access to certain American technology. So mitigating those cross-border risks and bringing it under China's own jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of friendly companies is a really big priority that's creating a lot of this decoupling and divergence. We also, of course, see the cybersecurity and data governance systems kind of creating these additional firewalls and barriers that cut China off in many ways from the rest of the world. But by doing so, they cut off European and other foreign companies from their kind of global networks. And similarly, we see a lot of the talk surrounding national security of what is called critical information infrastructure, essentially any sort of network equipment and services in certain industries that these have been deemed a top national security concern. And this is creating a lot of decoupling of literally like network equipment and interoperability and data flows that are really negatively impacting European companies and their ability to connect with the rest of their global networks. We also, of course, use China's self-reliance campaign, the dual circulation strategy to try to boost domestic consumption and decrease reliance on exports is a big part of this. As well, we increasingly see this indigenous innovation campaign and drive that's being used to try to close the technology gap in a lot of areas where China feels that it can make up that difference in the next 5 or 10 years, if not further into the future. And unfortunately, that inherently is going to mean a lot of favoritism towards Chinese companies in those areas, perhaps at the expense in terms of competition for European companies. And lastly, a vastly underappreciated term outside of China is this drive for autonomous and controllable value chains. This is an increasingly common talking point that originally started on the cyber and data security side of things in Chinese academia and then later government. And the idea was to create these systems that can kind of go it alone if they have to. Unfortunately, what we see is this is now expanded into broader discussion of network equipment and services and all things digital. And it's even increasingly getting into sort of broader supply chains from what we hear from European businesses on the ground. And of course, this is not just a game being played by China. Liberal market economies are also contributing as drivers. Largely, I would argue, because of long-term impatience with China's sort of incomplete accession to the WTO and incomplete opening up to the rest of the world in a reciprocal manner. This was not such an issue 10, 20 years ago when China was a relatively small, not so competitive player. Now that it is an economic superpower, this lack of alignment is less and less tolerable. And of course, there are the geopolitical frictions. And this is especially the case with the United States and Japan in regards to China. But we even hear, some rumblings of geopolitical frictions even in Europe. So where does this put European firms? It's very much between a rock and a hard place, because you have the demands from the Chinese government, and just to keep things kind of simpler, I'll focus on the US government as sort of the rock and the hard place. So the Chinese side is demanding that European companies pull themselves further into China in many areas. So there's an expectation that wherever possible, Chinese innovation should be advanced, Chinese brands and Chinese digital solutions should be adopted, Chinese technology should be adopted. And that should be as indigenous as possible to advance broader innovation goals within the country. But there's also a willingness to make space for foreign companies in certain areas where they will onshore their supply chains and onshore their technology chains through investment. And these are especially in areas where China feels it may not be able to catch up in the short or medium term. So they may as well have the foreign technology rather than via imports, then they would rather have it as European or American or Japanese investment to produce in country. Again, bringing it under the jurisdiction of the PRC and eliminating that cross-border risk of export controls or tariffs or quotas. And lastly, they'll continue to import where there's really no other option. I'll get into that in a little bit. And so in many ways, China's kind of demanding that everything gets pulled into their system. But on the US side, they're sort of demanding a purging of a lot of Chinese technology where they view various threats They are purging Chinese entities from financial markets where rules are violated or because of political reasons. And they are kind of disallowing a certain American technology to be sent to China. So China demands that you pull in, the US demands that you kind of cut off. And this is where European companies get really, really stuck between these two major players. So looking at the impacts for European companies, we have some really tangible examples here because these strategic goals, especially from the Chinese side, will create really diverse results for European companies, some quite good and some not so good. So we'll start with by far the worst, which is in areas where China wants to protect market share for its local companies, where they feel that they are globally competitive. We will see that foreign companies, including European ones, will increasingly be squeezed out of the market. This is most obviously true when you look at network equipment and services. Basically, anyone that competes with Huawei or ZTE, their days in China are kind of numbered in many ways. The critical information infrastructure rules, the autonomous and controllable rules, multi-level protection scheme, all of these things are being used on the grounds of national security, which may be legitimate in some cases, but probably isn't in many of them, is effectively making them pariahs for Chinese customers. Because it has now become a political mission that Huawei and ZTE must not only survive, but they must thrive and become globally competitive. So it is a political mission to ensure this. And one of the best ways to manage that is to get rid of the foreign competition. The second area, which is actually a very positive story, is to onshore foreign technology where possible. And the chemical sector is the clearest example of that. We saw in 2018, both BASF and ExxonMobil were able to get these approvals for 100% foreign-owned $10 billion chemical plants in Guangdong. And the logic was quite simple. They were unwilling to bring their cutting-edge technology into China if they had to have a joint venture partner, which previously they had always been required to. And they were able to convince the Chinese government, you don't want to keep importing this because that presents risks from trade wars, technology wars, export controls, et cetera. If you let us bring our best technology by allowing us to not have to enter a joint venture and therefore transfer our technology to our competitors, we would be happy to produce in your country in a nice, stable, reliable way. And they got what they wanted. They leveraged their position very, very well and had the red carpet rolled out for them. There are also a lot of areas of non-sensitive foreign investment where China has been, slowly expanding opportunities for foreign investors. The automotive sector is a good example of this. We saw opening in 2018, 2020, and 2022 for electric vehicles, commercial vehicles, and then passenger vehicles next year. And the reason for that is quite simple. This fits in beautifully with dual circulation strategy. By bringing in more foreign investment in these kind of technologically non-sensitive areas, there's going to be more domestic production, there's going to be more and better paying jobs, more taxes, and it's going to help enhance consumption within China. So it fits, again, very, very well into their strategic goals. Where China will continue to import foreign technology where necessary is in something like aerospace components, where Chinese companies are just not ready to close the gap on a lot of American and European aerospace component makers that feed into Boeing and Airbus and others. The thing is because of a lot of restrictions on these companies, because they're defense contractors, they're not going to be able to set up investments in China in a lot of those technologies. So at best, they will be able to import them in order for a company like Comac to finally get off the ground. And lastly, looking at foreign financial players and opening up new capital market channels, fully agree with Alicia here. They're trying to kind of pull the financial system closer to China and increase the world's reliance on it. But even in the areas where the red carpet has been rolled out, or in the non-sensitive areas, it's going to become increasingly difficult to do business in China. Between the tight data governance rules and these extensive localization demands of both supply chains and technology chains, this is going to result in business becoming too expensive for a lot of smaller companies to afford. When you look at small to medium-sized European banks that are in China, where they don't really see huge growth opportunities because of its saturated market, they're looking at the fact that they are going to lose their global connections in many ways, and they're going to have to replace all of their network technology with a local alternative that may not be as interoperable as they would like with their global networks, and saying it's just not worth the investment. So they'll just leave. And the larger European banks will swallow up that market share, but it will result in market exit for some of those banks. Those who aren't pushed out, the response so far has been to kind of follow China's self-reliance campaign, to localize as much as possible. You see this with the results of the business confidence surveys of the various chambers of commerce in China. And in many ways, they are looking at doubling down on the China market and becoming as self-reliant as possible so that they can effectively decouple as much as they can from their global networks and their global supply chains and their global operations. So that way they can be self-reliant in China for China, and therefore be reliable. And I'll end with the impacts on SMEs. This was something that Reinhard had specifically asked about. They'll also face really varied prospects. But when you look at those with really niche technology and know-how that fit within China's strategic goals and ambitions, they'll probably also have the red carpet rolled out for them. Again, China's willing to make some pretty considerable concessions if you have something that they really, really want for their strategic goals. And those SMEs that are supplying larger downstream OEMs may be able to find a lot of support to help get through this transition as these systems and technological systems and data systems sort of decouple. So if you are a supplier to Volkswagen or BMW or these larger players, you may be able to get a lot of support from your downstream OEMs because they need you as much as you need them. A lot of the other SMEs, though, that don't fit into either of those categories are probably in for a really, really rough time moving forward. It's going to be very difficult to continue operating there with compliance costs, with this kind of slow bifurcation of technology that will destroy economies of scale. It's unfortunately not good news for them. So on that sour note, I'll leave it at that, and back to Reinhard.
Well, thanks a lot, Mr. Gunter. And that now opens the discussion part of our event. Maybe I go to Alicia and Mr. van der Putten first. Would you want to react to some of the stuff that has been said by later speakers, or should I start asking my own questions and inviting participants? Alicia.
I can wait for the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Franz Paul?
Same for me.
Okay, good. So instead of going for the very strategic perspective, global perspective on the dialectic between selective or less selective decoupling and enhancing involvement and outreach in different sectors, I would like to look more at the way in which this affects investors and in which this affects companies. And I would like to raise a couple of points. The one point has just been made at the end by Mr. Gunter when he spoke about SMEs. From what I hear, this process of bifurcation of the Chinese market is already well underway. I hear, for instance, that in the automotive sector, increasingly, there is not just a localization pressure from the Chinese authorities, but there is also a technological change that has allowed Chinese suppliers to catch up with European suppliers technologically. And some people, and you probably all know better than me, but I've heard people saying, look, some of the arrangements that we still have with European suppliers feeding into the supply chain of automotive OEMs is more based on nostalgia than on hard economic facts, because Chinese suppliers could easily supplant the Europeans. And of course, that if that becomes a stronger trend, that creates a real challenge for our economy, because the innovative strength that we've had in Germany in the automotive sector has depended a lot on the interlocking cooperation between SMEs and OEMs in promoting gradual innovation. If the OEMs are more drawn into the Chinese market and tied into the industrial ecosystems of China in a kind of a Gulliver goes to China way, then what happens for the innovation partnership that we have relied on in the past? So that's one question. The other question is about the squeezing out. The classical example of a squeezing out that I know is the rail industry, where Alstom and Siemens helped China gaining ground technologically, and today they're up against the behemoth of CRRC, and they are not only pushing them out of China's market, but also making their life very difficult in third markets, and even gaining footholds in the European market. So there is this tendency of squeezing out. How does that affect, how do we deal with that? And then the point that Mr. Gunter also mentioned, the kind of decoupling within a company, where you have different technology portfolios for your operations worldwide and for your operations in China. And the most recent example probably is the data management law, which forces companies to have two simultaneous data management systems, which not only adds cost, but also creates political and juridical complications. So my question is, how would you think should European policy making or European member states policy making address these pressures that are increasingly making lives of our investors difficult? And then on the other side, there is, and Jörg Wuttke has been describing that many times, there is now a strong movement to invest more in China, not just from the EU, but also from the US. BMW is doubling down, for instance. So in a way, they're rushing into China head over heel, and I don't see how that fits with the strategic concerns that they should be up against. And I would invite all of you to comment on these problems from the investor's perspective, and what that implies, of course, for our national economies. Who wants to go first? I go by reverse order if you don't volunteer. Mr. Gunter.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just pulling up my notes here. Yeah, I think I'll start, and perhaps I'll just go for one, and then the other speakers can jump in. As investment into China strengthens, how does this kind of fit into the strategic concerns of those companies and those of governments? I think in many ways, this surge of investment is happening for a couple of reasons. The first is from a portfolio perspective. During times of economic difficulty, you're going to put what money you have where it's, where it has the highest ROI. And because of China's long-term handling of the pandemic, that means a lot of it was going to be going into China in any case, because that's where it would have the maximum yield. But beyond that, I think there's a pretty well-accepted perspective that the window of opportunity to make a lot of these investments may not last much longer because of political reasons. And that could be both regulatory reasons, but also just sort of reputational reasons. As concerns about geopolitical frictions and human rights grow over the coming years, as I think many of us would anticipate them to, it will become increasingly politically incorrect of sorts to really significantly increase investments into China. And also, there might be a window of opportunity available from the Chinese side that, as perhaps nationalism and this idea of creating these indigenous systems and indigenous supply chains grows, the window of opportunity in terms of China's openness may not also be taken for granted in the long term. As to how it fits, though, with their strategic concerns, I think this is one of the big problems, frankly, of a lot of companies, is that they have this immediate fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, but also the decision makers, their bonuses aren't going to be based on what happens 10 or 20 years from now for their companies. So they're making these decisions perhaps not on as long-term of a decision-making basis as they ought to. And obviously, in terms of strategic concerns of home governments, I mean, this is hardly the only place where corporates and governments will not have alignment on their strategic interests. But China is going to continue to politicize investment and trade flows, and that's just the reality. And I'm not saying that means that Europe should do the same, but it certainly needs to take that into consideration and how it moves forward, that we're not dealing with just another WTO partner.
Thank you. Mr. von der Putten.
I'd like to respond to the point about European companies developing a dual system where they have their operations in China decoupled from their global operations. I think this is a very, very interesting and potentially very important development. And maybe the longer term result of this could be that the companies who are doing this, that is the category of companies that is still has something useful to offer for China and therefore is not being squeezed out of the market. Those companies who can do this for a longer period of time could potentially develop into entities with a dual identity. It just happens to be that Royal Dutch Shell just moved its headquarters from the Netherlands to the UK, and previously also another company, Unilever, also moved its Dutch headquarters back to London. But there have been examples of companies in history that has some kind of dual identity that are grounded not just in some kind of country of origin, but also have a very strong identity and presence in a second country. So you can imagine that over time, those Chinese operations, those parts of those companies become more Chinese and less integrated into the rest of the company. A possible outcome of this could be that somehow these companies then become more Chinese and less European. The result could even be that they split up into different legal entities. So the Chinese part just becomes a different company. This is something I think the European Union and you should take into account as a possibility and try to figure out ways to deal with this. What are the repercussions of this? What can be done? And one, I don't know, I don't have the answer, but one thing that I think is that as long as there are also many Chinese companies investing in the European market, there's still more room to maneuver for Europe than if this would be a one-sided story where European companies are dependent on China for their investment and the reverse is not true.
Thank you. There have several people have posted questions in the Q&A, and we don't have time to address them all because we're almost getting to a close of the session already. But I would want to highlight one by Tobias Gerke, who said, what are necessary and possible next steps to get more coordination into EU policy response to address strategic dependencies? If you could pick that up also, Alicia, please.
Yeah. So what I like to say is that I think European companies and in a way will suffer more and more from this strategic dependence, but this for a number of reasons. First, size. So this is simple, you know, growth differential makes a difference in terms of strategic dependence, but this is leveraging upon an existing dependence. So I mentioned the case of solar panels, and there could be many. But on top of that, that strategic dependence is further pushed by the fact that China is increasingly coming up with a network, I would argue, of regulations that impinge on that strategic independence. And I think data you mentioned is a very good example. So we have data security law. It's not so much about privacy law, privacy data law, because that's very similar to the European framework. But I think that data security law is crucial because it's basically going to oblige European companies to store all of the data in China and localize it. And that sometimes might impinge on our own regulations, depending on whose data is this. So think about, for example, an innovation center. I don't know, we have, for example, Airbus has one in Shenzhen. They may be innovating on issues related to Europe. I mean, how can we actually know, or directly or indirectly, that data localization does not affect the business of, or let alone the research and technological innovation of that company in Europe? So as we move on to that situation, the push to transfer data and technology becomes bigger because you basically are obliged by law. And I think that beyond what I just said, size, and the fact that China is already very big in key new sectors, will make this strategic dependence basically unavoidable. And therefore, I think that's why I said that it's not enough to think about coercion, you know, anti-coercion instruments. It's not only about coercion, it's about the passive, because coercion is active. I do something against your interest, but strategic dependence is passive. You depend, thus, unless you do something about it beforehand, you're stuck there. So that's why I think we really need to think about value chains, reshuffling, and what this really means in terms of, you know, data localization, among many other new laws that are coming through in China that will affect our business there. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. If you allow me, and we have only 2 minutes left, so I would give you half a minute, Mr. Gunter, to answer to a question from Nora Sausmikat about the banking sector. Will they also leave in long-term perspective? Could you speak a bit more on the overall changes in financial markets? If you can just take 45 seconds.
All right, big question with a short amount of time. So yeah, the smaller and medium-sized foreign banks will be pushed out by all these data and tech localization rules. But the bigger banks will probably, the bigger foreign banks will probably be able to take up that market share, because the niche areas where foreign banks were able to actually gain any significant market share, and it's not truly significant overall, those are areas where Chinese banks are just not that competitive. So it's green financing, it's SME financing, things like this, cross-border services. So those will be areas where bigger foreign banks will be able to fill in. And the question is whether they will remain so over competitive compared to their Chinese counterparts in the long run that they can continue to profit from that niche, or if their Chinese counterparts will get better and better at those niches, and therefore their sheer size will just kind of crush foreign banks that are present in the market.
Thank you. Look, I have the impression we just started the conversation, but the time set aside for this exchange is already over. So I hope there will be more opportunities in the future to dig deeper into the issues that we touched upon. Let me finish this by thanking all the three experts, Alicia Garcia Herrero, Jacob Gunter, and Franz Paul van der Putten, for their contributions. Also, I want to thank the participants for their interest and their attendance, and I wish everybody a good day. Thanks, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.